Welcome to this lecture on food governance. I am Caroline Brand, researcher and lecturer in geography at ISARA, Lyon. The objective of this lecture is to give you insights on how local governments have dealt with the food issue in the past and more recently, and to understand also how we can engage in more sustainable food systems in an urban era. We will go back first to the past to see the way food has been regulated and the successive roles of local governments in that. Then, more recently, we will see how food is re-emerging on the agendas and the ways of food governance is being structured. Until the end of the 19th century, local public authorities intervened in the food system of their territory. The nourishing mayor was responsible for supplying the city, by controlling the price of bread and making sure it was accessible to everyone. Public regulation of the food situation was a vital element in guaranteeing social peace and thus ensuring political stability for the government in power. Cities exercised political control over the actors in the food chain, so that the search for economic profit did not take precedence over the function of feeding the population. Finally, they intervened in the management of the tools necessary for supply, such as slaughterhouses or commercial halls. And also they intervened in the control of the sanitary quality of the products. Food infrastructures and food inventories were central for cities and their governments. But progressively, they moved away from a strategic apprehension of the functioning of the food system. Other areas of intervention are becoming increasingly important for local authorities in the face of urban and industrial development, such as roads, transportation, and the local labor market. From the end of the 19th century, governance was partly transferred to the national and international levels and to the private actors of the agri-food system. As a result, local authorities still intervene on the food system, but for reasons far removed from the sole function of feeding the territory through the activities supported. There has been a disengagement. The strategic vision of the food system has been replaced by a sectoral approach on sectors of activity. Food activities have been supported through commercial, tourism, social, sustainable development or urban requalification policies. For instance, till recently, a slaughterhouse was supported for its role in the economic development of a sector of activity. This led to a loss of knowledge about the functioning of the food system that feeds the territory, and to the absence of the food issue from planning policies, even though it is an essential element in the everyday functioning of territories, in the same way as housing or mobility. In particular, planners have totally forgotten this issue. And by the 19th century, supralocal scales started to regulate the food system and its stakeholders. The regulation of food got sectorialized too. In Europe, it was even reduced to three main fields. First, an agricultural and commercial issue. It is the agricultural cocoon of food policies. The first food policies after the Second World War were looking for food security, and progressively, the economical logic has taken over. Then, a challenge of food quality, food safety. It is in between public health and trade protection perspective. It designs all the norms and standards that help secure the consumer and set protective milestones for trade. The food crisis of the 80s and 90s reinforced the product traceability and health quality monitoring systems. Lastly, a health and nutrition policy emerged in the 2000s in response to the social cost generated by poor diet-related disease. and France was a pioneer in this. But in 2018, networks of cities are being formed to act on food and contribute to the development of sustainable food systems around the world. Examples include the Sustainable Food Places Network in the United Kingdom, the National Network of Territorial Food Projects in France, and the Milano Urban Food Policy Pact at the international level. We could wonder, what happened? Why food is today back on the city's agendas? First, the flows and evolutions of the food system and the urban system contribute to bringing food back into the public sphere. There are more and more inequalities in terms of food access in cities. Sustainable urban development issues, demands for nature in cities, or management of agriculture at the edge of the cities. Then, the development of citizen actions, the emergence of a citizen alternative food system, stimulates the rebirth of food on the agenda of local authorities. And finally, because of what has been called the new food equation, which refers to new highly complex phenomena we are facing, such as food price surge of 2007-2008, when global wheat prices doubled, rice prices tripled, and 2 billion people were affected by that in terms of food insecurity. Also, urbanization that conducts cities to be very sensitive to food shortages, food security and food riots, land-grabbing processes to ensure countries' food security. As a result, food have popped up in cities planned for action in various cities around the world. Cities have realized they have levers to regulate some pieces of the food system, such as collective catering, management of agricultural and commercial areas, logistical issues, health policies, social policies, etc. Ideally, these policies try to connect the various dimensions of food and the various stakeholders related to it. Food governance articulates a variety of actors: civil society, private and public actors, and different themes of action that vary according to each territory, like human and health well-being, environmental integrity, transportation, energy, water, land use, urban regeneration, local economic development, cultural identity. But to this schematic representation, one should not forget the scales of actions of these actors. Different authorities from the city scale to the European scale of action have power and levers to regulate those fields of action. Power is shared regarding food. Urban food planning has emerged as the movement aiming at using planning to build sustainable food systems and at using food to rethink the relations between cities and their hinterlands. And so locally, the new food equation can be tackled. As a result, new professions are emerging, such as the food planner or the local officer in charge of the local food policy or plan. But there are limits. Despite the awareness of the need to develop integrated food policies and governance, the initial sectorization remains to be overcome. In particular, the variety of traditional and conventional players, such as retailers, wholesalers, craftsmen, distributors, processors, restaurants, etc., those players remain relatively unintegrated, even though they are essential to the actions on the food stakes of the territories. Also, the focus initially was mainly on how peri-urban agriculture could supply the cities, and so the major flows of food were not considered. Lastly, Agricultural actions are still poorly linked to consumers' actions, and they struggle to articulate with food justice and public health or food culture of the local communities. Moreover, you still have contradiction between policies. For instance, commercial urbanism that authorize huge commercial areas with deterritorialized food in the periphery of the city, and a food policy trying to connect the peripheric agriculture to the consumers inside the city. Partitioning and contradiction still remain in the overall treatment of food in a city. Some take-home messages to finish this lecture. Since the 19th century, and in particular after the Second World War, food gradually fell into a kind of oblivion at local scale, and at supra-local scales it has been reduced mainly to an agricultural, commercial and public health policy, the limits of which can be seen today for the consumer. But in the early beginning of the 21st century, food is re-emerging as a fundamental issue for local governments. Today, food has to be tackled by local governments, and in particular cities. It is not any longer the sole concern of national and international sectoral policies. As more and more peoples are living in cities, cities are bound to play an increasingly important role in alleviating food insecurity, for instance. And moreover, cities are hotbeds of innovations regarding food. As a result, cities are emerging as prominent food chain actors. But what is at stake today is how do we move forward regarding the limits I showed you? Here are the main references used for this lecture. Thank you for your attention.